Hi everyone, my name is Ike Chuck and I make a lot of my own clothes. In a recent video, I made this pair of pants. They were inspired by the style of trouser that was issued to the US Army as part of their working or fatigue uniform from the 1910s into the 1930s. They were also issued to the Civilian Conservation Corps during the Great Depression. Another part of this uniform was this style of what we might call like a pullover or a shirt, but they would have referred to as a jumper. I made a whole short talking about what a jumper was in the context of early 20th century workwear if you want to check that out. I think these things are so cool. I love the cut and the fit of them. They're boxy and a little bit oversized, and they've got these really cool pockets. They're large patch pockets with a side entry. In this video, I'm going to walk you through how I put one together. First up, I laid out and cut the jumper. I've got the fabric doubled here. It's folded selvage to selvage. And then I used some heavy objects to hold the pattern in place while I chalked around it. I drafted this pattern myself. I actually based it on a chore cut pattern that I'd done in the past, but I added some width to the shoulder since I wanted the shoulder seam to be off of the shoulder. I also made the chest wider as well because I knew the wider it was in the shoulder and chest, the easier it would be to pull on. I also completely removed the overlap at the center front and drafted a new sleeve and collar pattern. On the sleeve, the big change I made was lowering the height of the sleeve cap, since that's what I was seeing in originals, and it made sense with the fact that the shoulder was now wider. The fabric is the same 9 3/4 ounce Japanese Selvedge denim that I used for the matching fatigue trousers. I got it from Citron Jeans. It's on the heavier end of what's used for shirts, but it seems like the originals were made from the same denim as the trousers. The denim is unsanforized, which means it has the potential to shrink quite a bit. I decided instead of doing a full hot water wash, which would have taken care of most, if not all, of the shrinkage, I threw it in the washing machine with cold water and no detergent, which definitely took care of some of the shrinkage, but possibly not all of it, so we'll see what happens. The reason I did this is I didn't want a fully washed denim look for this project. I wanted something that was still dark with some structure, so I decided to accept the risk that they might shrink a bit. Stay tuned because I'll probably do an update when I wash that for the first time. With everything cut, I could start on the actual construction of the jumper, and I started with the placket. Now, the construction of the placket is really interesting. My friend Tom of Painted Pony Vintage sent me photos of his original jumper to work from. When we look at the exterior, it sort of looks like it might be constructed just like the sleeve placket on a shirt. But when we look at the wrong side, we can see that there's some interesting stuff going on. It's cut off center, and the wrong side of the button side of the placket doesn't extend the full width of the placket. I think both of those things might be due in part to the overall width of the placket. Now, what I decided to do with my placket is a little bit different, mostly because I wanted to use the selvage along the interior edges. But also, I'm not entirely sure what the order of operations and construction really looked like on the original. It's hard to tell just from photos. I think, for example, there might be a way of constructing it with both sides of the placket being cut as one piece, and it's just cleverly stitched and folded to create the finished placket. There's something about the bottom of the opening that really looks like that might be the case to me. That was more than I really wanted to figure out though, so I decided to just use 2 pieces. The first thing I did was cut open the center front. I started by finding and marking a center line, and then I drew out the finished width of the placket. You could just mark off the center line to get your cut line, which in this case is 3/8 of an inch to the left since we're looking at the back. But I thought it would be helpful to see the shape of the finished placket and easier to chalk in from those to get my cut line. Then I marked the length of the placket opening. Then I marked my cut line by measuring over from the side the width of the finished button placket. And then I measured and chalked 1/2 inch up from the bottom of the opening to account for some seam allowance there. And then I drew diagonal lines into the corners, which were going to be my cut lines. I messed up here. I shouldn't have chalked or cut all the way into the corner on the button side. Since the wrong side of the button placket doesn't extend the full width of the placket, I should have just marked and cut the width of the seam allowance that's turned under. I had to piece in some extra fabric. You'll see that later. I started the actual construction of the placket with the button side, since that needs to go in before the buttonhole side is sewn on. The first thing I'm doing is turning and pressing under the seam allowance on both sides of the placket, and I just used a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. Before I could attach the placket, I needed to deal with the part of the neckline that's not covered by the collar. And the button side of the collar is only set back from the front edge, the width of the seam allowance that's turned under. So I just marked down 1/2 inch from the neck edge, which is the seam allowance there, and clipped right along the selvage to that mark. And then I can turn and press under that seam allowance, and then refold and press the placket so that neck edge is totally enclosed. While I was at the ironing board, I also turned and pressed this triangle that was created when I cut open the center front to the right side. Because of the way the button placket is constructed, I needed to notch out the center front neckline in order to fit the placket. I marked in 1/2 inch from the front edge, which is the seam allowance that's turned under on the placket, and 1/2 inch down from the neck edge, which is the seam allowance there. And then I cut out that square. I test fit the placket at this point, and this is where I realized I'd messed up the cut at the bottom and was going to have to piece in some fabric to fix it. Once I got that pieced in, I got the placket in position to sew it on. I decided not to use pins here. Then I sewed that placket on. I started stitching from the center front along the neckline to close that. I didn't backstitch at the start, but I did go back and put the thread through to the wrong side and knotted it. Then I turned the whole piece and I top stitched down the selvage edge to the bottom through all 3 layers. As I went, I made sure the front edge was tucked inside that fold. As I got closer to the bottom, I wanted to make sure that the body of the jumper was pushed out of the way, so I was just sewing through the 3 layers and not through the body as well. Then I flipped the piece over and top stitched right along the folded edge from the bottom up into the seam allowance at the neck to finish it off. I've got the body pushed out of the way at the bottom here, which is only really possible because I messed up when I cut open the center front. If I had cut it open correctly, I would have top stitched the bottom part of this placket directly to the front, and it would have later been covered by the buttonhole placket. Starting on the buttonhole side, I turned and pressed under the seam allowance of the point and the seam allowance of the long non-selvage edge. You can see I've chalked in a line that I'm pressing to. That's the easiest way I found to turn in a consistent seam allowance. And then I could turn and press the whole placket in half, matching the long selvage edge to the long edge I pressed in. Then I needed to deal with the part of the neckline on the buttonhole side that's not covered by the collar. I set the collar 1 inch back from the front edge, so I marked in 1 inch, and then I marked down 1/2 inch from the neck edge, since that's my seam allowance, and I clipped up to that mark through both layers. Just like on the button side at the ironing board, I opened up the placket, and I turned and pressed the seam allowance under between the clips, and then I refolded and pressed the placket again. Before I attach the placket, I need to mark in where the top line of stitching is going to go across the placket, which should line up with the bottom of the placket opening. And then I'm also going to mark in the seam allowance again with chalk. This will give me something to line up the selvage edge with as I sew it on. From the wrong side, with the placket unfolded, I stitched from the bottom all the way up to the neck. You can see I've got the body of the jumper pushed out of the way, so I'm just sewing through the placket and the front. As I went, I made sure to double check that the selvage was still lined up with that line I chalked on the wrong side of the body. At this point, the placket should really fall into position and just needs to be top stitched into place. It's important to note I've got the end of the button side of the placket pulled through to the right side so it's enclosed when I top stitch around the placket following this pattern, which I should be able to do in one go. At the machine, I started stitching the placket at the line I chalked across it, all the way up that center front edge to the neck. You can see I've got the body of the jumper with the button side of the placket pushed out of the way, so I'm just stitching through the buttonhole side of the placket. Once I got to the neckline, I stopped with the needle in the material, and I turned the whole piece, and then I stitched across the neckline to close that. Once I got to where the collar is going to start, I pivoted so that the stitching would be hidden in the seam allowance, and continued to the outer folded edge. Then I turn the piece again and I top stitch down that outer folded edge from the neck towards the bottom of the placket. You can see I've put a few pins through the buttonhole placket to keep the layers from shifting as I sewed it. I had the button side of the placket moved out of the way as I stitched this edge because I didn't want to accidentally catch it as I was sewing. But once I got within an inch or so of the bottom of the placket, I moved the button side into position, and then I continued top stitching down that side. And then I top stitched around the point at the bottom of the placket, and then I top stitched back up that first side, and I stopped where I started stitching. And then following the line that I chalked across the placket, I put in those stitches right at the bottom of the opening, went down a few stitches, and then using the left side of my presser foot as a guide, stitched back across the placket, and this should provide some additional reinforcement. And then I went up 2 stitches to where I started. And that's the placket all finished. Here's what it looks like on the finished garment. I redid pretty much every single part of this placket at least once, sometimes because the stitching wasn't sitting quite where I wanted to, like along this fold here on the inside, but I also realized that in order to hide where I had to piece in that little bit of fabric, I needed to shift both plackets over just a little bit. I'm really happy with how it turned out though. With the placket done, I moved on to the pockets. The first thing I did was turn and press under the seam allowance around all 4 edges. I decided to use the selvage along the edge that was going to have the pocket opening. Otherwise, I would have had to double turn that edge in order to finish it off. Something I like to do on corners like this is give the seam allowance an extra turn so they won't stick out. It definitely creates some extra bulk, but I know my machine can handle it, and I think it gives a cleaner finish. With the seam allowance turned in, I marked the pocket openings. I had drawn out what I thought I wanted on the pattern, so I took measurements off that and transferred it to my pockets. I went an inch down from what's going to be the top edge, and I chalked the pocket openings at 7.5 inches from there, but I later went back and shortened them to 6.5 inches since 7.5 inches felt like it was too long. The machine, I top stitched between those marks from the right side. This first line of stitching I put in right along the folded edge. Then, because I wanted to mimic the look of a double needle machine, I turned the piece and put in a second line of stitching. I used the left side of my presser foot to maintain a consistent spacing. With the pocket openings stitched, I got those in position on the fronts. I'd already figured out where I want them on my pattern, so I just transferred those measurements over with a ruler. And then I put in a few pins to hold them in place while I sewed them on. Then I top stitched those pockets on from the right side all the way around the pocket. I started this line of stitching right where I finished top stitching for the pocket opening. I'm putting this first line of top stitching in just inside from that folded edge. I found that the closer I get to the edge, the more professional it looks in the end. I'm going to finish this line of stitching again just in line with that first line of top stitching I put in for the pocket opening. And then I turn the piece around and put in a second line of top stitching, again to mimic the look of a double needle machine. I also made sure that the beginning and end of this line of top stitching lined up with the top stitching for the pocket opening. And also, just like on the top stitching for that pocket opening, I used the left side of my presser foot to help me maintain a consistent spacing between these 2 lines of stitching. The original jumpers have bar tacks right where the pocket opening meets the top stitching that attaches the pockets. I did a few stitches back and forth to mimic the look of a bar tack and provide some additional reinforcement in that area. I decided I wanted to put the buttonholes into the placket at this point, so I marked those out with chalk. I started by drawing a line down the center of the placket. Most of the original jumpers I was looking at have 3 buttonholes, with the top one horizontal and then the next 2 vertical. I marked the top buttonhole 3/4 of an inch down from the finished neck edge, and then I marked the center of the next 2 buttonholes, and then I marked out from the center to get the finished length, which was 3/4 of an inch to accommodate a 5/8 inch button. I set the top horizontal button back 1/2 inch from the front edge, and then I just measured out to its finished length. And then I put those buttonholes in by hand. I sew all of my buttonholes by hand. I put together a whole video on how I hand sew buttonholes if you want to check that out. These I did in a slightly lighter weight thread than what I normally use, but I thought it would better match what I was seeing on the originals and look better with the fact that I was using a lighter weight thread for all of the machine stitching. It had been a little while since I had done this style of buttonhole with a bar on both ends, so I could tell I was a little bit rusty as I was sewing them, but I'm really happy with how these turned out. With the buttonholes all finished, I could join the fronts to the backs at the shoulders. I used a flat felled seam here. Now there's a lot of different ways to sew a flat felled seam, but the method I like starts by positioning and pinning the pieces with the wrong sides together. And then I sewed those pieces together. I used a 3/4 inch seam allowance for all of the flat felled seams on this garment. And then I'll trim down one of the seam allowances in half or just under half. You want to trim the seam allowance in the direction that you want the flat felled seams to point. In this case, I wanted the flat felled seams to point towards the front, so I'm trimming down the front seam allowance. And then I can turn and press the untrimmed seam allowance of the back over the trim seam allowance of the front. I'm stopping that edge just inside my first line of stitching. And then I press that seam flat. I found that the easiest way to do it is from the wrong side. You just want to make sure that the flat felled seam is pointing in the right direction. To finish off the flat felled seam, I'm going to run a line of top stitching right along the folded edge on the right side of the garment. With the body together, I started building the collar. The first thing I did was turn and press under the seam allowance along the neck edge of one of the collar pieces. This is going to be the upper collar. This is a pretty standard two-piece convertible collar pattern. Then I positioned the two collar pieces with their right sides together and put in a few pins to hold everything in place while I sewed them together. Then I stitched them together around the front and top edges. I started and finished a little way up from the folded edge to give myself a little more room when I'm attaching the collar to the body. I used a 1/4 inch seam allowance here. I used to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, but I would usually end up trimming the seam allowances down before turning the collar anyway. So I thought it would be easier just to stitch them at a 1/4 inch. This is something I will definitely be doing going forward. At the ironing board, before turning the collar right side out, I like to clip the corners and then press open the seam allowance of the top and front edges using this point presser. Something I think I want to try on the next collar I do is instead of pressing the seam allowances open, I've seen some people press the seam allowances over. I think it might help get a sharper corner, but it's something to experiment with. And then I turn the collar right side out. I like to use the handle of this paintbrush to help poke out my corners. You want something that's small enough that it'll get into the corners, but it'll still be blunt enough that you're not going to poke through the corner. And then I went back and pressed the seam allowances from the right side again, using the point on that point presser to really get into that corner and press it. I still wasn't happy with how sharp the corners were at this point, so I used a needle to kind of tease out the corners. The problem with this, though, is you can actually pick out threads like I did here. Easy enough to just trim those off, though. I've also found that sort of rolling and mashing the corners can help get them looking a little sharper. But the big thing here, for me at least, is just spending some time with an iron to get those corners looking nice. And then I could attach the collar to the body. I started by matching and pinning one of the center fronts. I've got the right side of what's going to be the under collar down on the body, and I'm matching the seam allowance that I didn't turn under on the collar to the neck edge of the body. After I pinned that first center front edge, I matched and pinned the center back of the collar and the body, and then I matched and pinned the other center front, and then I worked my way back towards the center back in order to make sure that the collar was set properly and everything was evenly distributed. And then I repeated that on the other side, working from the center front to the center back. And then I went ahead and stitched that collar on. I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance here. I've thought about using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I think it might make it easier to navigate some of the curves as you're attaching the collar and also pressing it. Something to experiment with at least. As I was going, I was just making sure that everything was laying smooth, both by manipulating the garment, but also putting my hand underneath the collar up by the seam line just to make sure that there were no puckers forming. I chalked in my seam allowance, so that's really what I'm following. But I also have a piece of masking tape as a guide. I actually chalked right up against the folded edge of the upper collar before I pinned the collar onto the body. At the ironing board, I pressed the seam allowance from the right side up towards the top of the collar. I've got a tailor's hand underneath here, helps me navigate some of those complex curves. And then I flipped it over, and the collar should really just fall into place at this point. But I like to go back in and give it another press just to make sure that everything is nice and flat and the bottom edge is sitting right where I want it, which is just over my first line of stitching. I like to go in with a line of basting stitches right above the seam allowance to hold everything in place while I top stitch the collar to close it. You could totally use pins here or just go for it on the machine, but I like to baste. It lays a lot flatter than pins do, and I think it gives me a little extra security. I also like to use this as an opportunity to double check that that bottom edge is in the right spot. I also don't mind a little bit of handwork. And then I could top stitch all the way around the collar to finish it off. I like to start and finish at the same spot near one of the shoulder seams. That way it's less noticeable if my stitching isn't perfectly aligned. I also like to start near the shoulder seam that allows me to stitch down most of the neck edge first, since it's loose. Once I got within an inch or so of that front edge, I stopped and made sure that the seam allowance was tucked in and everything was in the right position before turning and coming up the front edge and then stitching across the top of the collar. I'm putting this first line of stitching just in from the outer edge. I found that the closer I get to the edge, the more professional it looks. I redid this line of stitching a few times because I wasn't happy with how the top stitching was looking at the corners. Once I got close to that other front corner, I made sure the seam allowance was all tucked in and the collar was in the right position. I used a seam ripper this time to help tuck that seam allowance in, and it worked out really well. Starting right at the neck edge, I went in with a second line of top stitching just around the front edges and the top edge of the collar. This is the arrangement of stitches I was seeing on the collars of original jumpers that I was looking at. This was probably done with a double needle machine on the originals. And again, I'm just using the left side of my presser foot to help me maintain a consistent spacing between these two lines of stitching. And that's the collar all finished. I'm really happy with how it turned out. Moving on to the sleeves, this is what my sleeve pattern looks like. It's a two-piece sleeve with a vent at the wrist. To get the overlap or underlap on the vent, I just added on a rectangle the width of half of my seam allowance, which is also the width of my finished flat felt seams. For me, I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance, so I added on a rectangle that was 3/8 of an inch to the under sleeve. And then the length is just the length you want the finished vent. Starting on the actual construction, I'm just marking in the seam allowance on the upper sleeve. I'll use this as a guide to double turn the vent edge, and also as a guide for how far I'm going to clip into the seam allowance to facilitate double turning that vent edge. And then I'm just using the undersleeve to figure out the length of the vent, and then I'm clipping all the way up to that line, that 3/4 inch line. I also marked and clipped at the bottom where I'm going to turn up the hem because the seam is on an angle, so I thought that that might need to move independently, but it didn't really matter that much. And then I'm moving on to the undersleeve, marking in 3/4 of an inch from that extension, and then marking over at the top of the vent and clipping all the way up to that 3/4 inch line. At the ironing board, I turned and pressed the seam allowance of the vent in half at 3/8 of an inch, and then turned it and pressed it again to finish off the raw edges. I also double turned and pressed the other side of the vent on the other half of the sleeve. To finish those off, I top stitched right along the folded edge from the wrong side. I made sure to start or finish at the top of the vent, depending on which direction I was stitching. I didn't backstitch there, but I did go back and put the thread through to the wrong side and knotted it off after the fact. With the openings of the vents hemmed, I joined the two halves of the sleeves together. And I used a flat felled seam here, but unlike the shoulder, I actually positioned and pinned these with the right sides together. I just made sure that the edge was all aligned and everything was in the right spot, and I put some pins in just to hold everything in place. I like to position and sew this seam with the upper sleeve on top of the undersleeve. That way, when I get down to the top of the vent, or if I'm working on the other sleeve starting at the top of the vent, I can make sure that this line of stitching is in the right spot because I want it to start or finish just inside from the folded edge of the vent on the upper sleeve. That way, when the sleeve is opened up, everything is aligned properly. At the ironing board, just like on the shoulder, I trimmed one of the seam allowances in half or just under half. In this case, I trimmed the seam allowance of the upper sleeve. And then I turned and pressed the untrimmed seam allowance from the undersleeve over the trimmed seam allowance, and I stopped that edge just inside my first line of stitching. And then I pressed it flat from the right side, making sure that the seam allowance was pointing towards the upper sleeve. Back at the machine, I top stitched from the right side, right along that seam, from the top of the vent, all the way up to the top of this sleeve. In general, I like to work with the seam to the left of my presser foot, so on the other sleeve, I started at the top of the sleeve and worked my way down to the top of the vent. And then I turned the piece around and put in a second line of top stitching, which should catch the fold on the wrong side and finish off this seam. You could put this line of top stitching in from the wrong side, just following along that folded edge, but I wanted these two lines of top stitching to be really parallel, and I wasn't 100% confident that my seam allowance was super consistent, so I thought it would be easier just to put it in from the right side. I can also feel where the fold is as I'm sewing to make sure I'm catching it, and I know because of the size of seam allowance I'm using that it should be about the width of the left side of my presser foot. And then I'm just stopping at the top of the vent, and the originals have a bar tack here, so I'm just doing a few stitches back and forth to mimic the look of a bar tack and provide some additional reinforcement in this area. With the sleeves assembled, I can attach them to the body, that way I can sew the underarm and side seam in one go. I positioned and pinned them with the right sides together, and I started by matching and pinning the underarm and side seam at the front, and then working my way up to the shoulder since I want the front of the sleeve to be really smooth. I didn't draft the sleeve with any ease, but there always ends up being a little bit, and I want any excess at the top of the shoulder at the back where it's useful for movement. So then after I pinned up to the shoulder at the front, I matched and pinned the underarm and side seam at the back and worked my way up towards the top of the shoulder. I had put a mark where I thought the sleeve seam with the vent should go, so I matched and pinned that, and then continued matching and pinning up towards the top of the shoulder. You can see the little bit of excess there, so what I did is split it in half and put a pin in the middle, and then put some pins on either side of that to help distribute it. I also find that pulling gently on the two pieces helps align them as well. Then I stitch those sleeves on. I've got the body on top of the sleeve here. That's the easiest way I found to sew it. As I'm going, I'm making sure that no puckers are forming. I'm just putting my hand underneath the body and smoothing everything out as I go. You can see I've chalked in the seam line. That's really what I'm following as I'm stitching, but I've got a piece of masking tape down as a guide as well. At the ironing board, just like on the rest of my flat felled seams, I'm trimming one of the seam allowances in half or just under half. In this case, I'm trimming down the seam allowance of the body since I want the flat felled seams to point towards the body. Then I turned the untrimmed seam allowance from the sleeve over the trimmed seam allowance of the body and pressed it. Since there's slightly more fullness in the sleeve head than there is on the body, I'm working in sections. I started at the underarm and side seam at the back and then moved up towards the shoulder a little bit and turned and pressed that and then pressed between there. This just helps me make sure that everything is distributed evenly and laying smooth. I've got a tailor's ham underneath here, which helps me press this sort of curved three-dimensional form. But then I'm just working my way around the arm's eye, turning and pressing in that seam allowance, stopping that edge just inside my first line of stitching. Then I flipped it over and pressed it from the right side, making sure the seam allowances were pointing towards the body. Again, I've got the tailor's ham underneath here to help me press some of these complex curves. You can see I'm just sort of manipulating the body and the sleeve to make sure that everything is laying flat and smooth. I'm not trying to press this so it's super flat. I'm actually sort of creating a little bit of a ridge here. Then I flipped it back over to the wrong side to double check that everything was still turned and pressed under. There was a few spots that I decided to go back over because they seemed like they were a little bit wide or things weren't turned under properly, especially in the areas over flat felled seams, which are a little bit bulky and don't want to turn as nicely. Back to the machine, I put in my first line of top stitching from the right side, right along the seam on the body side. Because both the armscye and the sleeve cap are so curvy, it helps to stop every once in a while and move the piece so that no puckers form. It gets a little bit easier as you move up towards the top of the shoulder where things are a little bit flatter. I'm putting this first line of stitching just in from that seam. And then I flip the piece around and put in my second line of top stitching, which should catch the folded edge on the wrong side and finish off the seam. Just like on the sleeve, you could totally put this line of stitching in from the wrong side, just following along that folded edge. But I really want these two lines of stitching to be parallel, so I find it easier to put it in from the right side. I can feel where that folded edge is on the wrong side to make sure I'm catching it, but again, it should also be about the width of the left side of my presser foot because of the seam allowance that I use. Here's what the armscye looked like when they were all finished. These turned out pretty good. There's a few spots that are maybe a little bit wide. This could be because my initial seam allowance was a little bit wide, or I didn't do a good enough job when I was turning and pressing that seam allowance. With the sleeve set, I closed up the side seam and underarm seam in one go. I started by matching and pinning the armscye seams at the front and back. Then I moved down to the hem at the bottom of the body and matched and pinned there before working my way back up towards the armscye. Then I matched and pinned the hem at the cuffs before working my way towards the armscye. This just helps me make sure that everything is evenly distributed. I used a flat felled seam here, and just like on the shoulder, I positioned and pinned the pieces with the wrong sides together. Then I got those seams stitched up. I'm using a 3/4 inch seam allowance here, just like the rest of my flat felled seams. I've got a piece of masking tape down on the bed of my sewing machine that I'm using as a guide, since my machine doesn't have a numbered plate. Just like the rest of the flat felt seams on this garment, I trimmed one of the seam allowances in half or just under half. In this case, I trimmed the seam allowance of the back since I wanted these flat felt seams to point towards the back. And then I turned and pressed the untrimmed seam allowance from the front over the trim seam allowance of the back, stopping the edge of the untrimmed seam allowance just inside my first line of stitching. And then I flipped it inside out so I could press those seams flat, making sure the flat felt seam was pointing in the right direction towards the back. I really want to make sure these are flat before I put in that second line of top stitching on the machine, since it's going to be really tricky to sew. And then I flipped it right side out again, just like on the sleeve head, so I could double check that everything was still turned under. Where the flat felt seams come together at the armscye is really bulky, so I definitely needed to return and press there. I also went in with a hammer to help flatten that out and make it a little bit easier to sew. To finish off the seam, I top stitched from the right side right along that folded edge. It's pretty easy here on the body, but once I get to the armscye and start working my way down the sleeve, it's going to get a lot more difficult. It's definitely easier to sew it in this direction from the body to the end of the sleeve, and I can usually do it in one go. But since I like to work with the seam to the left of my presser foot, on the other side I'll start at the wrist, and once I get near the armscye, I found it's easier to stop, pull the piece out, and rearrange it and restart at the same spot near the armscye. The reason this is so tricky is you're basically sewing on the outside of a closed tube. In order to make this work, I'm going to almost turn the sleeve inside out, sort of rolling it into itself. And I'm making sure that I have everything clear underneath the needle, and I can usually get a couple more inches free to sew. And then I'll just continue working my way down the sleeve, adjusting as I need to make sure that everything is free and clear underneath the machine so I'm not catching anything that I don't want to. It's only going to get trickier the farther down the sleeve I go. This is right at the bottom, and you can see how tight it is. With the body and sleeves all together, I moved on to the hem at the bottom of the jumper. I went with a double turned 3/4 inch hem. It's slightly wider than I probably would have done, but looking at photos of originals, it seemed like the hem at the bottom of the jumper was wider, and it also seemed to be about the same as the hem at the wrist, which I'd already decided to do a 3/4 inch hem there to accommodate a button and buttonhole to close the wrist. So I just turned and pressed up 3/4 inch. You can see I chalked a line that I'm pressing to. I used a hammer to help flatten out the bulky seams at the side seam. And then I turned and pressed it again to finish off the raw edges. I used the sleeve board here. It gave me an elevated surface to work on, and it also made sure that I wasn't pressing through to the other side of the garment, which could have created unwanted wrinkles. But thinking back about it, I probably should have just used the end of my ironing board since it would have given me more surface area to work on, which means that I would have had to rotate the garment less. Then I stitched that hem to finish it off. I'm putting this line of stitching just in from that folded edge. I decided to start and finish at the same spot over one of the side seams. That way it's a little bit more inconspicuous where that join happens. I've got the garment turned right side out. That's the easiest way I found to stitch this, and then I'm just rotating the garment as I'm stitching. And then I turned and pressed under the hem at the wrist. I mentioned I was doing a 3/4 inch hem here, but since I was going to put a buttonhole into this hem, I didn't want to do a double turned hem since I didn't want to put a buttonhole through 3 layers of denim. So I started by turning and pressing under a 1/4 inch, and then I turned and pressed under 3/4 inch. Instead of chalking a line that I pressed to, I just used a ruler to make sure I was getting the width of that hem correct. I used the hammer again to flatten out the seam to make it a little bit easier to sew. I'm using the sleeve board here again for the same reasons as the hem, to give me an elevated surface to work on, and also make sure that I'm not pressing any creases through to the other side of the garment. Just like the hem on the bottom of the jumper, I top stitched right along that fold from the wrong side to finish it off. I started on the end that was going to be the underlap on the undersleeve. With the hems finished, all of the machine work on this project was done. All that was left was a little bit of handwork, including putting the buttonholes into the hem at the wrist, so I just laid those out with chalk. I knew I wanted them to be centered on the hem, so I just measured and marked at half the distance of the width of the hem, and then I knew I wanted them to be 1/2 inch back from the opening of the vent, and then I just marked out the finished width of the buttonhole, which was 3/4 inch, just like the rest of the buttonhole. And then I stitched those buttonholes by hand. You can tell I actually filmed and finished this project quite a while ago, since it was actually warm enough to sit outside and hand sew these. I really struggled with editing this video. I'm not sure why, but it's something I want to work on. I think editing more as I go and working on the voiceover more as I go will help. But I really want to put out more videos and work on more projects this year because, in general, I really enjoy it. I'm planning on making a whole video about my sewing plans and goals for this channel within the next couple of weeks, so stay tuned for that. With the buttonholes all sewn, I could mark out the position of the buttons. I made sure the placket was in the right spot, and then I used this chalk pencil that I got at an art supply store to mark out their position. I could have probably done a better job of making sure these were centered in the buttonhole, but I don't think it matters all that much. And then I attached the buttons. I used a single length of heavy wax linen thread here. I don't like to tie a knot if I don't have to. I found that taking a stitch through the same spot twice will anchor my threads well enough. You could bury the tail of the thread if you really wanted to, but it's going to be underneath the button. Then I threaded on one of the buttons and stitched through the opposite hole, passing the needle to the wrong side. I did that a few times, passing the needle from the front to the back, and then the back to the front, going through the same set of holes each time. Then I brought the needle up from the wrong side through one of the other holes that I haven't stitched through yet. And I took a few stitches through the opposite hole to create an axe. There's a lot of different patterns you could do, but I like the classic axe. With how heavy this thread is, I found that I don't need more than a few stitches in each direction. The buttons are vintage army buttons. This is what would have been on the original jumpers. I believe they're made of zinc, which is kind of cool. I got them off eBay. I'm not stitching these on super firm because I like to do what's known as a thread shank. So after I finish stitching through the holes, I pass the needle up to the right side and I wrap the thread around the threads holding on the button a few times. This will lift the button off the front of the jumper just a little bit and create a space for the buttonhole to set. After I had wrapped it a few times, I put the needle back through to the wrong side and I knotted it off here by taking a stitch through that cluster of threads that hold on the button. And then I'll put my needle through the loop that I just made and then through the new loop that I made. And once I pull it up, it'll create a nice little knot. The last thing I did was attach this label I made with my initials. It's inspired by the laundry marks that you see on things like shirts in the 18th and 19th century. I cross-stitched it by hand in blue silk on some hemp canvas. I drew inspiration for the letters from samplers from the 18th and 19th century, and I'm just using a herringbone stitch to attach it. With that label on, this project is all finished. And here's what it looks like on. I'm really happy with how this thing turned out. I think the cut and fit is really good and really matches what I was seeing in vintage photos of these things being worn. And in general, it really resembles surviving vintage examples. One thing I wish I would have done differently is I wish I would have made the sleeve vents just a little bit longer, like maybe half an inch. They ended up a little bit short, but otherwise, I'm really happy with it. Let me know what you think, though, and let me know if you have any questions. And thanks for watching.